We need to start in Minnesota because this is where the entire thing cracked open. Not rumors, not theory, Minnesota. And now the names are unavoidable. President Donald J. Trump, Ilhan Omar, Tim Walz, FBI Director Kash Patel, and the FBI. Let's not forget about the Department of Justice and, of course, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, folks. What began as a few so-called daycare centers in Minnesota has turned into something far darker, a fraud web that is so large that even federal investigators are now calling it just the tip of the iceberg. Just the tip, folks. Empty buildings, fake providers, millions of dollars flowing out, and somehow nobody even noticed until they couldn't ignore it anymore. Independent journalist Nick Shirley, he hit the scene, yo. He did what state officials and legacy media refused to do. He went there, he filmed it, and he showed the country what was really happening. Yes, he went there. And once the public saw it, the federal government, they had no choice but to move. So now under President Donald J. Trump, the movement has turned into momentum. In fact, the FBI is now expanding. The DOJ is tracing the money, and HUD, Housing and Urban Development, is uncovering something just as disturbing. Billions of dollars sent to people who should never have received a dime, including the deceased and the ineligibles. Kind of like the stimulus checks, sending checks out to dead people. This is no longer about one state, folks. It's no longer about one program. In fact, it is definitely no longer containable. So when fraud spreads quietly for years, the collapse never comes quietly. And this is exactly where we are right now. Some of these folks are going to jail. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. I really appreciate you guys. Let me know where you're watching from. Anybody here from Minnesota? Let me know. Today, the ground zero is Minnesota, okay? Let's just go ahead and name it plainly. It's 2026 now. President Donald J. Trump, Representative Ilhan Omar, former Governor Tim Walz, FBI Director Kash Patel, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They're all tied to one expanding investigation. And this is not another isolated scandal. This is actually a connected fraud web that quietly grew while oversight stalled, then snapped into focus under Trump's second presidency. And so, look, investigators, they're now describing a system, not a mistake. This was actually a well-coordinated system, a system of programs stacked on top of programs, money moving faster than verification. And there was a lot of political protection here that delays the consequences. Now, Minnesota matters because it exposed the pattern first. Now, once the pattern appeared, federal agencies, they stopped treating it as a clerical issue like clerical noise, and they actually started treating it as if it was organized abuse, which is exactly what it was. Arrests began, audits widened, subpoenas multiplied. Nothing collapsed overnight. It metastasized state by state, office by office, until the evidence forced action to take place. In fact, the question now isn't whether something happened. I think that part's very clear. Now, Minnesota's daycare and welfare fraud, this was the ignition point. Inspectors and journalists found empty buildings listed as daycare centers and childcare centers, fake providers claiming services that were never rendered, and single locations pulling in millions of dollars every single year. Oversight failed, completely failed, while Tim Walz's administration expanding funding created a pipeline where speed mattered more than verification. Then, of course, there's Ilhan Omar. Of course, we'll get to her in just a second. But the paper compliance replaced physical checks. The result was predictable. Money flowed, children did not. And so this wasn't discovered by accident. This surfaced because on-the-ground visits contradicted the official reports, exposing this massive gap between the filings and reality. And that gap right here, folks, this is why Minnesota triggered federal interest. Now, if local controls collapsed this completely, investigators asked, well, what happens to programs with larger budgets and weaker safeguards? The state level failure has become a warning flare for national agencies. In fact, Minnesota was not the fire itself. In fact, it was the spark that revealed dry timber everywhere else. When a system can't confirm who exists, who qualifies, or who delivers the services, the problem is never local. So now this story does not move forward without Nick Shirley. Let me tell you here, this man stepped up to the plate and he hit it out the park. Drop a Nick Shirley down below if you appreciate what Nick has done for the American people. So while agencies filed reports and officials issued reassurances, Shirley, he did something embarrassingly simple. He just went to the locations. He filmed them. He knocked on doors. What he found were buildings that existed only on paper. No kids, no staff, no operations, yet millions in taxpayer money had already been pulled out. Now that contrast right there, it detonated public trust. One independent journalist produced evidence that state systems claimed did not exist. But sure enough, it did. In fact, Nick Shirley's videos, they went viral because they remove abstraction. Viewers didn't need spreadsheets or audits. They saw with their own eyes the emptiness that was there. And once that evidence reached tens of millions of people, institutions lost their ability to quietly manage the narrative. And so state agencies offered silence or deflection. Legacy media, they hesitated, but the proof didn't disappear. It sat right there, undeniable, forcing federal agencies to acknowledge exactly what locals had missed or just straight up ignored. When systems fail quietly, exposure doesn't come from press releases. It comes from real receipts. And Nick Shirley, that man brought the receipts. Now, this is exactly how a lot of people get hurt financially without even realizing it. Look, a couple thought that their retirement money was safe. They really did. I mean, they did everything right, saved responsibly, trusted the system, and then they found out that their Medicare plan had been quietly overcharging them for years. They said that was our money, not the insurance company's money. Does anybody resonate with that? And so that line right there, it struck with me. It really did stick with me because this is the same story that we're talking about tonight. Money moving where it shouldn't because nobody was checking. That's why I partner with Chapter, folks. They don't sell insurance. They fix Medicare coverage so that wasted dollars stop leaking out your pocket. Now, most people watching the show right now are calling the phone number right here at the bottom of your screen, 909-563-8279. And of course, it's a totally free service, totally free phone call, or they're clicking the link in the description down below, askchapter.org/Ron, to have somebody actually review and verify what they're paying for. Because whether it's government programs or your own retirement, biggest losses happen quietly until somebody finally looks. And so as the investigation widened, attention shifted from street level fraud to political proximity. Look, Ilhan Omar became a focal point, not because of speculation, but because of geography, influence, and history. Minnesota had already produced one of the largest pandemic fraud cases in U.S. history. Now, another massive failure has unfolded in this same political ecosystem. And I think it kind of makes sense why a lot of people are asking, what is Ilhan Omar's direct implication is in this, right? And so President Donald J. Trump, he didn't invent the connection. He just simply amplified it by publicly calling attention to the pattern, to Ilhan Omar. Trump forced a national conversation about how long these systems operated without consequence. That spotlight that Trump turned on really matters. I mean, what it does is it reframes the issue from administrative failure to accountability. The scrutiny intensified because Ilhan Omar represents the very district where oversight collapsed, and because prior fraud prosecutions already placed Minnesota under a microscope. Now, the question became unavoidable. How many layers of protection existed between the money and the people responsible for the oversight, right? When attention moves upward, investigations change tone. This is where fraud stories stop being, local news and they start becoming political tests. So when FBI Director Kash Patel described the Minnesota case as just the tip of the iceberg, just the tip, well, that wasn't rhetorical flair. That was procedural language, guys. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not escalate resources, expand jurisdictions, and loop in parallel task forces over clerical mistakes. They don't do that. They only go after the big dogs. So what Kash Patel was signaling is that the indicators matched organized fraud, repeat actors, replicated methods, and money flows that crossed program lines and state borders. And so once that threshold is crossed, cases stop shrinking. They widen. They get bigger. Minnesota triggered that shift. The FBI, they began treating the activity not as an isolated abuse situation, but as a system that could be copied, scaled, and hidden inside emergency funding structures. And so this is why the language changed. This is why arrests weren't the endpoint. They were just the entry point. And so when the FBI says systemic, it means investigators expect to find the same fingerprints everywhere. And when they say financially massive, it means that they're already counting zeros that most people haven't even seen yet. This was not a warning, guys. This was a confirmation. And so once the FBI establishes the scope, the Department of Justice, they take over the trajectory. Look, Trump's DOJ approach is methodical. They start with the lowest rung, secure cooperation, then they trace the money upwards. Street level fraudsters are not the end end goal. They're just the leverage. Financial records, shell entities, pass-through nonprofits, and of course, the political insulation becomes the real focus. And this is where Ilhan Omar falls under the microscope. This is where exposure risk enters the picture. Money doesn't vanish, it moves. And every move leaves documentation. Under President Donald J. Trump, the DOJ has broader latitude to essentially pursue these chains without political hesitation that stalled past cases. And so that doesn't mean conclusions are pre-written. It just means that questions are no longer off limits. Who approved funding expansions? Who ignored the audit warnings? Who benefited indirectly from keeping the system running and just keeping their mouth shut? Those questions don't get answered on television. They get answered through subpoenas, testimony, and paper trails. And so once DOJ commits to following the money, containment stops being possible. You can't outrun your own records. Now, the fraud story stops being state level the moment that HUD enters the picture. Investigators reviewing rental assistance programs discovered a pattern that mirrors Minnesota almost perfectly. Payments issued at speed, verifications lagging behind, and eligibility checks treated as optional. Well, folks, the results were stunning. Billions of dollars in rental aid sent to recipients who were either deceased or legally ineligible. They're sending billions of dollars to dead people. What the heck is going on here? That is not a paperwork glitch. That's a system that's just paying out without confirming who exists. The connective tissue matters. Same emergency logic, same pressure to move money fast, same blind spots. HUD did not invent the problem. It inherited a structure that rewarded distribution over diligence. And once auditors pulled on that particular thread, the same question surfaced again. Who signed off? Who waived checks? And who benefited from keeping the pipeline open? Different program, same fingerprints. When two unrelated agencies surface identical failures, investigators stop asking if and they start asking how many. This is when a scandal stops being isolated and starts behaving like a network. Now, to really understand why these failures multiplied, you have to look at how Biden-era emergency programs were designed. Speed was the priority. Distribution was the metric. Oversight was deferred. Federal agencies were pressured to push funds out quickly with the promise that verification could be handled later. Now, in practice, later never came. Minimal checks became normalized and temporary exceptions hardened into permanent habits. Now, that doesn't assign guilt by default, but it definitely explains the vulnerability. Under President Donald J. Trump, these programs are not being relitigated politically. They're being re-examined procedurally, line by line, rule by rule. Investigators, they're not asking why the money was spent. They're asking why safeguards were bypassed. And when you review emergency programs with a post-emergency lens, the gaps stand out immediately. Policies written in haste, they create records and clarity. And this is exactly why these reviews matter. They transform urgency into evidence. And so once investigators stepped back, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Minnesota wasn't an anomaly. It was an early indicator. In fact, the same warning signs began appearing everywhere, elsewhere. I mean, look, rapid fund distribution, minimal verification, repeated vendor structures, and identical paperwork errors that weren't errors at all. Investigators, they don't need every state name publicly to see the replication. Fraud doesn't innovate endlessly, it copies what works. When one system pays quickly with weak controls, that template spreads. That's what pattern recognition looks like, and that's what it does. It strips away the excuses. The moment that you see the same methods used across different programs and jurisdictions, coincidence disappears. Minnesota mattered because it showed exactly how the playbook worked. Other states mattered because they confirmed that it wasn't isolated. This is why federal agencies escalate together. They aren't chasing the rumors, they're mapping the behaviors. And once behaviors repeat, accountability stops being optional. Patterns turn local failures into national cases. That, my friends, that is when containment collapses. Now, in a normal cycle, stories that are this large, they dominate the headlines. Here, the silence has been the headline. I'll show you exactly what I mean. Legacy media hasn't sustained coverage, they haven't pressed officials, and they haven't challenged explanations that conflict with documented evidence. That absence is not accidental, it's defensive. Look, when a story threatens too many narratives all at the same time, avoidance becomes the strategy. Silence buys time, but time does not erase public proof. Millions have already seen empty buildings, contradictory filings, and audit confirmations. And so once evidence is distributed directly to the public, traditional gatekeeping loses power. The lack of investigative pushback doesn't signal confusion, it signals risk aversion. Institutions retreat when the cost of engagement outweighs the benefit of the spin. And that retreat tells audiences something very important. This story is too large to manage cleanly. When coverage drops despite expanding investigations, the silence itself becomes corroboration, not because journalists agree, but because they just can't control the outcome. And so what changed was not the evidence. What changed was enforcement. With Donald J. Trump back in office, federal agencies, they were given something that they had not had in years: permission to finish the job. Now, that doesn't mean political targeting. It just means removing political shielding. Leadership changes at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, and oversight cooperation with Department of Housing and Urban Development. It shifted priorities from damage control to accountability. Investigations that once stalled now move. Subpoenas that once hesitated now land. This isn't about revenge. It's about standards. Programs that moved trillions of dollars cannot be immune from review simply because they were labeled emergency. That doesn't work. Trump's enforcement posture isn't louder, it's firmer. And when enforcement becomes consistent, systems that relied on delay, they start to crack. That's when long-running schemes lose their oxygen. So this scandal feels different because there is no single release valve. This isn't one bad actor, one rogue agency, or one failed program. Multiple agencies are converging at the exact same time. Public documentation already exists, distributed beyond recall, and there's no clean scapegoat to absorb the pressure. Minnesota exposed the pattern. The federal reviews confirmed it. The media silence amplified it. What's unfolding now isn't a conclusion, it's a process. And processes like this, they don't end with speeches. They end with records and arrests. This is why uncertainty hangs in the air, not panic exposure. When systems fail quietly for years, accountability doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives methodically, piece by piece, file by file. This isn't finished, guys. Not even in the least bit. It's unfolding in real time under active investigation with no guarantee of who gets named next. And this is really what makes it so dangerous for anyone who assumed that it would be buried. Now, if you want more updates on this, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on all notifications, and I'll see you next time.